Certainly a bowl game where we pin two of the better teams playing before New Year's Eve against one another in the Russell Athletic Bowl. North Carolina 11-2 against Baylor, a preseason favorite to get to the college football playoff, finished off at 9-3. We bring in Jeff Greenberg from Sports Gluttons to help us break this one down. Jeff, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, always.
You know, Jeff, before we break down the personnel and look at the game matchup here, you just have so many great coaching and player contacts and really develop some good storylines there in some of the contacts and in some of the content that you've developed in recent weeks. Can you let us know what you're currently working on?
Yeah, thank you for that. Right now, the weekly 5 with Fedora, which is the interview series I have with Coach Larry Fedora at UNC. Obviously, during the bowl break, there's a break with that because we usually like to do it post-game. So the last one of the season will be after the bowl game on the 29th. But currently working on an interview article with Ryan Switzer, who is the do-everything player for UNC, punt returner, just got named first-team All-American specialist. Actually just announced that he was coming back for his senior year. And I've kind of been following him and his family for a while. His family actually is a large family, close-knit family. His parents are the type of folks that come to every game, support him. And so it's a really compelling family story from all his parents to his uncles to his grandma, and kind of links into actually the family atmosphere that Fedora has tried to build at UNC. So trying to tie all that in right in time for Christmas.
Switzer leads the Heels with 52 receptions, 6 touchdowns, 668 yards. He has been a menace in the punt return game and as a wide receiver in his time in Chapel Hill. You know, Elijah Hood's a kid that I would wager that if you asked most college football fans, even ardent fans, to list their top 5, 6, 7 running backs in the nation, that he wouldn't be on most of those lists. But wow, 1,345 yards, 17 touchdowns. It's really been his emergence that's, in my eyes, has been one of the key elements to this championship drive by North Carolina.
Oh, no doubt. I think ESPN the other night or somebody, one of the main analysts talked about that Elijah Hood basically is the best running back that nobody knows about across the country if you're outside of the ACC. He was a 5-star kid that came out of Charlotte, North Carolina, originally committed to Notre Dame, switched that to UNC. And it's you hit the nail on the head right there. The big difference this year for UNC from last year is they had no running game last year. Now, part of that is blocking. Part of that is a seasoned offensive line that has made huge improvements this year with the first-team All-American Landon Turner and a few other all-conference guys. But Elijah Hood has been one of those keys that they just didn't have last year. And as much as people think Larry Fedora's offense is a passing air raid type deal, it really isn't. His type of spread likes to have a balance between a run and pass, and Elijah Hood has provided that this year.
And to that point, Jeff, statistics make liars out of all of us, I know, but obviously there's some relevance there. Marquise Williams last year in 2014, 22 touchdowns, 9 interceptions, almost identical ratio to what he had this season at 21-9. So it's definitely been Elijah Hood supplying the balance to the offense that has made a difference. Just your thoughts about Marquise Williams. We, of course, saw him on opening night, and most of college football was really honed in on that South Carolina matchup being the #1 kickoff on that Thursday night. He didn't have the best performance. And then we kind of lost track of North Carolina until late in the season when some of us noticed, wow, look at this team at Chapel Hill. If they win the next few, they're in great shape to make a push for an ACC championship. Your thoughts about Williams in his senior season?
He's made huge strides this year, one from last year to this year with his progressions and really in his passing game. But I think also it was a big deal for him to overcome that first game. That was a hometown game for him in Charlotte. It did not go well. A lot of guys that could have affected and dragged on during the year. I think that's where his maturity came in, that he had a short memory and really put out a dynamic year. He's in the top 5. I think he's the 5th player in ACC history to go over 10,000 total yards. He also changed his game a little bit. As Coach Fedora said, like when he ran the ball, he ran the score, which means he didn't hesitate once he decided to run. And his passing was much improved. I mean, if you really look across how many guys caught a ball this year for a lot of yards and touchdowns, which means he was reading the route tree and getting through those progressions, not just targeting one guy. And I think, again, having a running back, too, to kind of take that pressure off, his running game opened up even more. He had close to 1,000 yards himself running. So I think Marquise has definitely had a strong senior year. They would not be here without him. I think that he's looking to have a good final game here against Baylor. But his growth this year has been outstanding from just a quarterback mental standpoint compared to years past.
And Jeff, the numbers definitely bear you out here when you talk about looking at college football teams. And as you understand, I scour the stat sheets in preparing for these bowl games. And what you typically see is you see one guy with a ton of receptions, maybe 70, and then another guy with like 45, and then it drops off the map. Because there's an elite player, and then the other guys aren't nearly as good as him, or there's a security blanket out there for that quarterback. But you look at 4 exceptional players with more than 26 receptions for Carolina, with Ryan Switzer, with Quinshad Davis, who I believe is the all-time leading pass catcher at North Carolina. Then you got Mac Hollins and you got Bug Howard. So his distribution of the football obviously makes it difficult on the defense.
Absolutely. I think they've had so many weapons to use this year, and Marquise's ability to recognize that and get all of them involved was the big question mark coming into the season. I think he's definitely answered that question well. You have the receivers you talked about, the big, tall possession guys, but that can stretch downfield, and Bug Howard and Quinshad Davis. You have Mac Hollins, who's about as fast as a blazing receiver as you see and seems to always get behind people, having an outstanding year. Then you have Switzer, who kind of does everything and has really expanded his skill set this year from just being the underneath guy to breaking loose downfield, coming across the middle, doing a lot of different routes. And then the one guy that has kind of regained his footing as one of the leaders on this team is the running back, TJ Logan. He's kind of the where Hood is that powerful runner. Logan comes in at that change of speed. It's just got that quick burst. And we saw that against Clemson. I mean, he took a screen pass for 45 yards for a touchdown against Clemson. So it's kind of pick your poison. And then one name to remember going into the bowl game and next year is Brandon Fritz. That's the redshirt freshman tight end. He seems to be coming open more and more during the season. We saw it against Virginia Tech. We saw it even against Clemson. Marquise didn't hit him, but because the focus has to be on those receivers you mentioned, he's now starting to be that tight end that can go down the middle and surprise some people.
It's not a great defense, but it's so much improved over what we saw in 2014. And when you look at the stat sheet, and that's one of the reasons why I have you on here, is that you can sort through the stats and tell us what's real. There's not a guy with 12 sacks or 15 tackles for loss. The contribution of big plays on this team defensively spread out. You got Ethan Farmer with 6 tackles for loss, but that, along with Jeff Shetmer, 6 tackles for loss, 2 picks, those are your top producers in terms of making plays in the backfield. So who's getting the job done? Is Gene Chizik this good coordinating a defense?
The first thing he did, and this will be echoed by Coach Fedora week in and week out, is instill confidence in these guys. That's the first thing he did. He actually mentioned that he looked at the film from last year, and what he looked for, he wanted to see which guys quit and which guys didn't. And that was going to tell him who he was going to have to work with in terms of a confidence standpoint. The second thing he's done that's been very noticeable to fans of UNC and around the ACC is they always seem now to be in the right position on any situation. So they don't have a lot of flashy stats, but they do have great stats, say, in the passing game. They're one of the top 10 teams in interceptions, one of the top teams in pass breakups. And the technique is there that you see in the defensive backfield, which has allowed also, though, the defensive line, because it's young. It's all basically sophomores, redshirt freshmen, has progressed. And as the season's gone on, they're getting more and more pressure on the quarterback, which showed against NC State in their season finale. So you're right. It's nothing that stands out. It is a true team effort. And the one stat that matters, and at the end of the day, is scoring. They averaged giving up about 40 points a game last year. Their average this year was 22 points. That's a big difference considering you have the type of offense you do to step in. And, you're hoping that offense, which does average well over 4 touchdowns a game, if you can hold the other team to 3 touchdowns, you're doing pretty good.
Jeff Greenberg is decked out in his Carolina blue, joins us from Sports Glutton. When we look at the Baylor team, they tossed 45 touchdown passes this year, Jeff. Unfortunately for Baylor fans, the kid throwing the ball in this Russell Athletic Bowl's got 3 out of the 45. So they've had their injuries at quarterback. Seth Russell was a Heisman Trophy candidate, threw 29 touchdowns. Jarrett Stidham, a 5-star kid, came in, played capably, although there was definitely a downgrade in performance. He's just a freshman, 12 touchdowns, 2 picks, but it's going to be Chris Johnson in this game that's really going to compromise what Baylor likes to do on the offensive side.
And that's what these bowl games leave question marks out there, because you're talking about a situation where if it was right after their last game against Texas, it's probably an iffy situation, but they've got 3.5 weeks to prep for this game. I'm just one of those believers that you don't doubt a guy like Art Briles and what he may be able to pull together. I mean, in that Texas game, which they lost, they basically were going with no quarterback by the end of that game, and yet somehow they started piling up the yards in the second half. So it's one of those things where I'm sure they would like to have one of those first 2 guys starting. They don't have them, so at least they know that as they have 3 weeks to prep. And with Baylor, they've been there. They've been in big games. And I really think it just depends on which Baylor shows up, because there's a big difference between the Baylor that started the season and then the Baylor you saw in November in terms of statistics.
Yeah, college football fans know all about Corey Coleman, caught 74 balls, 20 touchdowns, and those numbers very much compromised by the quarterback situation. He was on pace to shatter Michael Crabtree's Big 12 touchdown record. He sat on 20 for like the last 4 or 5 weeks of the season. Katie Cannon is a kid that tore up Michigan State in the Cotton Bowl last year. He caught 46, and it was actually Jay Lee, a kid that caught 36 balls, isn't much talked about, but he had the biggest home run threat in regards to yards per catch. But it could possibly be Shock Linwood, who carried for over 1,300 yards and 10 touchdowns. That's going to be the bell cow for this Baylor team. You know what interests me here, Jeff, is what I think is going to be the strength-on-strength matchup is we don't credit the Baylor defense for being too strong, and overall it's a fairly average defense. But up front, they are stout. They have some future NFL prospects in Sean Oakman, who had 14.5 tackles for loss. Jamal Palmer's a great player, 13.5 tackles for loss. Andrew Billings is probably the MVP of the defense coming in. So does Elijah Hood run for yardage against that front 4, in particular for Baylor? I think that could be the whole key.
I would agree with that. I think the UNC offensive line versus the Baylor front will decide the bulk of this game. I mean, you just mentioned Andrew Billings, who's the Big 12 Defensive Player of the Year. Their front is for real, and it's going to be a big test for UNC. A little different test than maybe the front was from Clemson in the ACC championship game. I mean, if you watch Clemson, those linemen seem to be as fast as other people's linebackers. Baylor's is a little different. They're just the strong Midwestern, solid guys up front. So if they can get some running yardage with Hood, that'll be a big difference maker for UNC. If they can't, because of the Baylor front, then it's going to force them into doing some things with Marquise in the running game, but also, again, having to make sure his arm is on and he's connecting with his receivers, because like you said, you don't know exactly what's going to happen with the Baylor quarterback situation in terms of what he's going to be able to do. Their running back, who is second team All Big 12 that you mentioned, does have 10 touchdowns behind a solid offensive line. Coleman's the best receiver in the country. He's the real deal. But again, before November, they were leading the nation in 48 points a game, 600 yards a game. Baylor was. After the month of November, that average dipped down to 32 points a game, which was about 42nd in the country. The yards per game was about 493 yards per game, which dropped out of the top 20. November was also when we saw, like you just mentioned, that surge from UNC, and where they were averaging 50 points a game and only giving up 22 points a game. So that's going to be a key, because the Baylor defense before November was only giving up 28 points a game. The Baylor offense defense in November was giving up around 34 points a game. Was that a factor of the offense not being exactly what it was and the defense being on the field more? That was tell. The other thing too is November, like the other Big 12 schools, was when the backloaded schedule of Baylor took effect. Playing Oklahoma, playing Oklahoma State, playing TCU. So, again, it's not like they were playing slouches when those numbers dipped in November.
Yeah, that's a difficult one to weigh. We know that both were a factor. Baylor injuries, especially at quarterback, but also that they were playing much better teams. And if you've heard one knock that I've had for Baylor, it's in regards to scheduling, and they played three real softies that they really muscled up their numbers on in the passing game, and the backloaded Big 12 schedule makes it difficult to assess how much of those numbers were attributed to the quarterback play and situation with injuries versus the tougher schedule. Always motivation is a storyline during these bowl games. Unfortunately, in the ACC, you've got the playoff participant and then the New Year's Eve or New Year's Day bowl game with the Florida State game playing in the Peach Bowl. That's considered a big time bowl game. And then people that aren't really in the know that think, okay, these are two quality teams, Russell Athletic Bowl. They hear Russell Athletic Bowl, and it seems like a fourth tier bowl, and it's the third seed in the ACC against the third seed in the Big 12. This is a big deal. These are two quality teams, both ranked in the top 10 or 12 in the country. Do you think there's any motivation issue there for North Carolina in particular, or either team?
Well, I think it's going to be different for both teams. I think with Baylor, you're going to have to ask, has just been a wearing year in terms of injuries and not fulfilling where they started, losing 3 out of their last 4, or does that propel them to want to make a statement that they didn't go away and they're going to overcome the challenges they've had? For UNC, I think the motivation's there because they can make history in terms of their program by winning the 12th game for the first time in school history. They are ranked 10th. When they do those first teams out, like the March Madness brackets that come out, UNC was the first team left out of the New Year's bowl games. So I think there's a chip on the shoulder there. I think the motivation will be there for the seniors to go out with the most wins in school history in a season, which is 12, first time ever done. I think a lot of guys also are looking to use this as a springboard to next year. Last year, they had a bad bowl experience, and it took a lot to overcome that in the offseason. They don't want to have an offseason like that again. They want to solidify the fact that, I mean, we're not used to talking North Carolina football in the top 10. They win this game, they finish in the top 10. The basketball team is ranked outside the top 10 right now. So that's one of those things we're not used to talking about. I think the motivation will be there for them.
That's right. North Carolina looking to culminate a 12-2 campaign and probable finish in the top 10 after knocking off Baylor if they are able to do it. I think this is a premier matchup in the making, aside from the Baylor quarterback issues, which could put a damper on the outcome of this game to a certain extent, but it's still North Carolina-Baylor. It's a serious matchup in the Russell Athletic Bowl. Jeff, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate the time, man.
Thanks. Anytime. Appreciate it.